Inside this building sits the government of the world's most populous democracy, but for years, its ability to defend its borders rested almost entirely on factories located thousands of miles away. From 2013 to 2019, India held a specific global ranking for 6 consecutive years. It was the single largest importer of military weapons on the planet. To outfit its military, India spent billions buying hardware it could not build at home. It bought submarines from France, helicopters from the US, and rifles from Israel. By mid-decade, nearly 60% of its entire arsenal was sourced from Russia. For a 5,000-year-old civilization and a top 5 global economy, this total reliance on foreign factories created a strategic liability that undercut the very idea of national independence. This deficit began on August 15, 1947. While the newly independent nation inherited a standing army, it possessed no domestic facilities capable of designing or producing a complete modern weapons platform. This vacuum was a deliberate result of British colonial policy. For nearly 2 centuries, the imperial government suppressed Indian industrial capacity to ensure the subcontinent remained militarily dependent on London. Faced with widespread poverty, the government of Jawaharlal Nehru prioritized civilian infrastructure. Dams and steel plants were the priority. The creation of a military-industrial base was pushed to the bottom of the list. This choice allowed India to focus on development, but it also meant that when its first major geopolitical crises arrived, the nation had no way to manufacture its own defense. The consequences became clear in 1962. During the Sino-Indian War, Indian soldiers were sent to the Himalayas in summer uniforms with bolt-action rifles from the Second World War. The lack of modern hardware led to a rapid and decisive military defeat. The shock of 1962 triggered a frantic search for weapons. With Western powers hesitant to sell, India turned to the Soviet Union, which provided tanks, artillery, and jets through heavily subsidized loans and preferential trade agreements. India began building Soviet designs, like the MiG-21 under license. But while Indian technicians learned how to assemble these jets, the Soviets never shared the design logic behind them. India was following blueprints without learning the engineering principles required to write them. This created an illusion of strength. India possessed modern hardware, but it still lacked the capacity to innovate or iterate on that hardware independently. Domestic policy further stifled growth. Under the License Raj, private Indian companies were completely prohibited from manufacturing defense equipment until 2001, leaving the industry as a total monopoly of state-run organizations. These state-owned factories operated with guaranteed government contracts and no private competition. Without the pressure to innovate or meet quality standards, production methods in some facilities remained unchanged for decades. The failure of this system was exemplified by the INSAS rifle. Developed over 15 years, the weapon was so prone to jamming and mechanical failure that soldiers in the 1999 Kargil War reportedly discarded them in favor of captured enemy weapons. The financial scale of this dependency is massive. Over a single decade, India spent approximately $100 billion on defense imports, capital that was exported directly out of the Indian economy. Nearly 60% of Indian spending went to Moscow, making military maintenance subject to a foreign capital's stability. This reliance limited foreign policy. Strategic decisions required calculating how a supplier might respond and if they'd continue flowing spare parts. The danger of this arrangement became an existential threat in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, the supply lines for 60% of India's military equipment went dark. Tens of thousands of essential spare parts and the technical experts required to maintain them were suddenly on the other side of a dissolving border. Russia transitioned from a strategic ally into a commercial vendor. No longer offering preferential rates, Moscow began demanding immediate cash payments for the hardware India desperately needed to keep its Air Force and armor divisions operational. The crisis proved that a national defense built on the foundation of another empire is only as stable as that empire itself. The final catalyst for change was the 1999 Kargil War. India was forced to fight a high-altitude conflict using artillery purchased in the 1980s. Corruption scandals had frozen the procurement process for over a decade, making it impossible to buy new guns or develop a local alternative. This occurred while India was conducting nuclear tests to assert its status as a global power. The gap between its nuclear ambitions and its reliance on aging foreign rifles was no longer sustainable. The reality of the Kargil conflict ended decades of bureaucratic stagnation. It forced a policy shift that opened the defense sector to private Indian companies, ending the state's 50-year monopoly on production. The lesson learned in 1999 was that true sovereignty is not something that can be purchased from a foreign vendor. It is a capacity that must be built at home. In the global arms trade, there is a polite term for the money that moves in the shadows, the commission. It is a carved-out percentage of a sale paid to the agents who ensure a government contract reaches the right hands. In 1986, India signed what was then its largest arms deal ever, a $1.4 billion contract for over 400 Swedish Bofors howitzers. The deal was intended to modernize the Army's aging artillery with the finest field guns in the world. That ambition collapsed in April 1987 when Swedish radio reported that AB Bofors had paid roughly $40 million in secret bribes to Indian politicians and bureaucrats. The scandal ended Rajiv Gandhi's government and turned the word Bofors into a political slur. The fallout created a permanent state of fear within the Ministry of Defense. Procurement officials realized that any signature on a foreign contract could lead to a career-ending investigation. To avoid scrutiny, they chose inaction. Files sat untouched on desks for a decade while the Army's requests for new equipment went unanswered. This bureaucratic freeze had its reckoning in 1999, during the Kargil War. Indian troops were forced to fight a high-altitude conflict using those original Bofors guns from the 80s. Because no new artillery had been bought in 12 years, soldiers had to make do with aging barrels and dwindling spare parts in the middle of a mountain war. The Bofors scandal didn't just end political careers, it stalled the modernization of India's military for a generation, creating a procurement gap that left soldiers vulnerable on the front lines. While foreign purchases were frozen, India's domestic solution was already in place. The Defense Research and Development Organization, or DRDO, was funded to develop indigenous weapons and end the country's reliance on foreign manufacturers. But the DRDO struggled to deliver. The Arjun tank project, initiated in 1972, became trapped in a cycle of shifting requirements. The Army would ask for a change, the DRDO would restart the design, and the years would slip away. The tank finally entered service in 2004, nearly 20 years late and already a generation behind its rivals. The Tejas light combat aircraft followed a similar path. Launched in 1983 to replace the aging MiG-21 fleet, it didn't see operational service for 33 years. By the time it was ready, the technology it was meant to pioneer was already standard in the rest of the world. Those 3 decades of delays forced the Air Force to keep flying the MiG-21, a jet so prone to accidents it was nicknamed the Flying Coffin. Over 170 Indian pilots died in crashes because no indigenous replacement was ready to take them out of the cockpit. The DRDO's failure wasn't a lack of talent, but a system that prioritized technical reports and committee approvals over the immediate operational needs of the soldiers in the field. Beneath these visible delays lay a deeper structural problem. The international arms trade offered financial rewards for imports that domestic programs simply could not match. On a $5 billion fighter jet deal, a 2% commission is $100 million. It moves through offshore accounts to reach approving officials. This creates a perverse incentive. Domestic projects yield only a government salary, while foreign deals offer millions in untraceable commissions. Anti-corruption investigators observed a pattern where domestic projects would be derailed just as they reached completion. Requirements would be tightened, or testing criteria would be changed in ways that favored foreign alternatives, ensuring the more profitable import was the only remaining option. The result was a procurement system that effectively penalized Indian innovation, making foreign dependency the most lucrative choice for those within the state. These failures had severe consequences for India's maritime security. In the Indian Ocean, a high-stakes environment with increasing rival activity, the Navy's submarine fleet is its most critical tool of deterrence. While strategic requirements call for a minimum of 18 conventional submarines, the reality by the mid-2010s was far lower. Due to maintenance and refit cycles, India sometimes had as few as 7 or 8 boats fully operational. Project 75, intended to build 6 French-designed Scorpion submarines in Mumbai, was meant to solve this, but cost overruns and disputes over technology transfer delayed the project for decades. The first submarine, supposed to be ready in 2012, wasn't commissioned until 2017. The submarine crisis showed that even for the most essential tools of national survival, the bureaucratic trap was inescapable. By 2014, the cumulative effect of these delays was a military in crisis. The Air Force was flying a fraction of its required squadrons, the Army was using decades-old gear, and the naval fleet was shrinking. This was the trap. India was spending billions of dollars to support foreign factories and technology, yet it was no more capable of defending itself independently than it had been 30 years prior. Escaping this required moving beyond minor policy changes. The state had to stop treating defense as a series of individual purchases and start treating it as a core industrial priority. The swearing in of a new government in May 2014 marked the beginning of this transition. The focus shifted away from the paralysis of the Bofors era toward a model centered on mandatory domestic production and local ownership of technology. The decades of systemic delay had pushed national security to a breaking point, making the shift toward building India's own weapons no longer just an ambition, but a requirement for survival. Significant changes in military posture usually start with a deployment or a border skirmish. In India, it started quietly on a Tuesday in August 2014 with a routine press release from the Ministry of Defense. By 2014, the existing system had reached a breaking point. The country was spending billions to import foreign weapons, the domestic industry was a stagnant monopoly, and both China and Pakistan were actively modernizing their forces. The government responded with a framework called Make in India for the defense sector. This pyramid shows the new logic of procurement. For the first time in 6 decades, private Indian companies were allowed to manufacture military hardware, while foreign imports were pushed to the lowest priority level. To enforce this, they introduced a positive indigenization list. This list acts as a hard ban. If a system is on it, the Indian military is legally prohibited from buying it abroad. There are now over 400 items that must be built domestically. Past initiatives generated reports and committees. This framework sets specific public financial targets, reaching 175,000 crore rupees, about $21 billion, in domestic defense production by 2025. By attaching hard financial numbers to policy, the state shifted its role. It stopped acting as a passive buyer of equipment and became a project manager, placing domestic suppliers on a strict clock. The ultimate test for this new policy was the Tejas light combat aircraft. The program had been in development since 1983. After 31 years of delays, it faced skepticism from the Air Force and was frequently dismissed by international observers. Instead of canceling it, the government issued a 2021 contract for 83 upgraded Mark 1A jets. The agreement was worth 48,000 crore rupees, but it came with a catch. The manufacturer had to double its delivery rate from 8 aircraft per year to 16. This forced Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, the state-owned manufacturer, to overhaul its entire operation. To meet the deadline, the company had to restructure its factory floors and manufacturing logic under intense pressure. Part of that overhaul involved qualifying over 300 new domestic vendors to build complex components, ranging from fasteners to radar subsystems that were previously imported. The Tejas Mark 1A proved that a legacy state monopoly could double its output when forced by hard, unyielding deadlines and specific financial penalties. While the Tejas was about fixing a legacy system, the BrahMos was about creating a new one. Born from a 1998 joint venture with Russia, it is now the most capable weapon system in the Indian arsenal. It is a supersonic cruise missile that travels at Mach 3. It skims the sea to evade radar, launches from jets, ships, or trucks, and executes terminal maneuvers to bypass enemy defenses. The secret to its success was organizational. The program was structured like a private corporation rather than a government department. This meant a CEO with the authority to make decisions in days instead of months. In January 2022, the Philippines signed a $375 million deal to purchase the system. Today, over 15 other nations are in active negotiations to buy the BrahMos. By selling a high-end system to a nation with access to Western alternatives, India shifted its identity from a reliant consumer to a global competitor. However, domestic growth requires a period of pragmatism. For over a decade, India tried to finalize a deal to build the French Rafale jet locally, but the negotiations repeatedly stalled over costs and technology transfer. In 2016, with its Air Force shrinking, the government pivoted. They abandoned the massive licensing deal and simply purchased 36 fully built jets directly from France to get them into service immediately. The decision provided immediate results. When border tensions escalated in 2020, the Rafale sensors and weapons integration gave the Indian Air Force an advantage that was clearly understood by the other side. But the Rafale saga also taught India a lesson. They couldn't secure the technology transfer they wanted because they didn't yet have the domestic manufacturing base to act as an equal partner. It proved that dependency is a trap. A nation only gains the leverage of a partner when it has the capacity to build, not just the cash to buy. That capacity is now expanding. The government is actively courting private conglomerates, giving them access to military testing facilities and R&D outputs that were once restricted to the state. Tata Advanced Systems is now exporting helicopter fuselages to the United States and has partnered with Airbus to build the C-295 transport aircraft, the first military plane manufactured by India's private sector. Companies like Bharat Forge transitioned from automotive parts to heavy artillery. Their ATAG system eventually set a world record for the highest altitude artillery firing during its testing phase. To maintain this momentum, a program called IDEX began funding agile startups. Today, over 300 small companies are developing everything from AI surveillance to advanced materials for body armor. By injecting capital into the private sector and startups, the government bypassed slow legacy boards and created a rapid prototyping ecosystem that delivers working technology. The data proves it. Domestic defense production doubled from 440 billion rupees in 2014 to 1 trillion by 2023. Exports climbed even steeper, from nearly 0 to 21,000 crore rupees by 2024, reaching global markets. India has moved from a reliant importer to an aggressive aerospace and arms exporter, generating wealth through its own industrial base. The Make in India mandate succeeded because it recognized a modern reality. True national security isn't just about the weapons you hold, but the industrial capacity to build them yourself. In January 2022, a Philippine Navy base received a shipment. Historically, when developing nations bought weapons, they accepted older, second-hand equipment. But the crates on this dock held the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile. This was a brand-new, current-generation system, purchased at full market price, and it was made entirely in India. For decades, the Indian defense industry was known as a massive importer, struggling to meet its own military needs. Selling top-tier hardware abroad was virtually unthinkable. Manila had the budget to buy American, European, or Israeli systems. They reviewed the global market and made a deliberate choice to rely on Indian technology for their coastal defense. To understand how unusual this is, look at this chart of India's defense exports. In the 2013 to 2014 fiscal year, total foreign sales sat at 686 crore rupees, about $80 million. For the world's fifth largest military budget, that footprint was remarkably small. Following a massive overhaul in procurement and production policies, that number climbs sharply. By 2024, exports hit over 21,000 crore rupees, a 30-fold increase in exactly 1 decade. The hardware is flowing out to over 85 different countries. The client list stretches from island states like Mauritius needing patrol vessels to large emerging economies in the Middle East and Africa. They are evaluating highly complex aerospace engineering. The Tejas light combat aircraft, which spent 30 years in development, is actively competing against Swedish and South Korean jets for international contracts. Beyond fighter jets, India is shipping guided rocket artillery to active conflict zones like Armenia and selling mobile air defense batteries like the Akash system. Even NATO-adjacent countries are negotiating for these platforms to restock their arsenals. The domestic industry has graduated from simply assembling imported parts under license. They are designing, testing, and exporting their own intellectual property. For the last 20 years, nations looking for affordable military hardware usually turn to Beijing. China supplied everything from drones to frigates at deep discounts, often backed by generous state-subsidized credit. Supplying these high-end platforms buys access. When a nation relies on Chinese hardware, Beijing gains maintenance contracts, political leverage, and valuable intelligence access in regions spanning from Southeast Asia to sub-Saharan Africa. But geography creates friction. Countries like the Philippines and Vietnam share highly contested maritime borders with China. Arming their militaries with Chinese sensors and missiles presents an unacceptable security risk. India offers a compelling alternative. They sell precision strike weapons and radar systems at competitive prices, but they also include aggressive technology transfer agreements, teaching the buyer how to build the weapon locally without demanding geopolitical subservience. When you supply the primary defense systems for a dozen regional allies, you become indispensable. That market position gives India deep strategic leverage and insulates it from diplomatic coercion. To compete at the absolute highest tier, however, the engineering has to evolve. Current Indian platforms are highly capable, but they do not yet possess the radar-evading geometry and sensor fusion required for fifth-generation stealth combat. The tightest bottleneck in aerospace is propulsion. Building a jet engine requires material science and metallurgical tolerances that only a very small, exclusive group of nations possess. India's domestic engine program, the Kaveri, has seen decades of rigorous testing but hasn't reached the exact thrust-to-weight ratios required for frontline fighters. Because of this, the Tejas fleet currently relies on imported American power plants to fly. To close that gap, the defense sector is funding its next generation of hardware. The Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, recently approved for full development, is a twin-engine stealth fighter designed from scratch to achieve top-tier dominance. That same acceleration is visible on the ground. The Zorawar light tank went from concept to functional prototype in less than 4 years. It is engineered specifically for high-altitude Himalayan warfare, operating easily where heavier traditional tanks stall out against peer adversaries. Platforms that once took 30 years to conceptualize are now being prototyped, tested, and fielded in a fraction of the time. Defense planners often use a specific metaphor to describe this transition. For 70 years, India was the patient in the waiting room. They had to ask foreign suppliers, the doctors, what weapons they could buy, at what price, and on what schedule. Building a robust domestic manufacturing base inverts that dynamic. When you have the capability to design your own systems, you no longer have to accept whatever terms are handed to you. Global aerospace giants recognize this. Companies like Boeing, Airbus, and Dassault are setting up local maintenance facilities and shifting assembly lines for helicopter fuselages and transport aircraft directly onto Indian soil to win contracts. Foreign contractors offer these concessions because they know India has options. The ability to walk away from the table and build the hardware locally is the ultimate negotiating tool. Relying entirely on imported security comes with a severe cost. It meant operating vulnerable supply chains that could be shut off by foreign capitals during a conflict. It meant sending soldiers into battle with equipment reliant on the political goodwill of someone else. The engineers inheriting this industrial ecosystem today are operating under entirely different parameters. This generation does not remember a time when domestic manufacturing was an impossible dream. They are actively refining weapon systems that work. Their ultimate proof of concept sits in the water. In 2018, the Navy commissioned the INS Arihant, a fully operational nuclear ballistic submarine. Look at this map showing global engineering capabilities. Mastering nuclear propulsion, extreme pressure hull fabrication, and underwater acoustics is so difficult that only 6 countries on the planet have successfully built one. India is on that list. That vessel carries a sovereign nuclear deterrent, built by domestic engineers, patrolling the deep ocean entirely free from outside permission. By mastering the hardest disciplines in aerospace and naval engineering, India has secured its own autonomy and built the arsenal of the global South.